On this episode of Strange Things Are Happening, Graystar takes you to Madame Sherri Forest, located in West Chesterfield, New Hampshire, to investigate the claims of paranormal activities surrounding the land of the late Madame Sherri. Known by many names, Madame Sherri, born Antoinette Vermeer in Paris in 1878. She was an eccentric dancer and fashion designer known infamously to the people of Chesterfield as Madame Sherri. In 1930, some years after the death of her husband, Andre Raila, also known as Anthony Marcuzzo, Madame spent many years traveling the world with her close and famous friend, Charles Lamar, in order to cope with the loss of her love. After Charles and Madame's travels ended, Madame met a silent film actor by the name of Jack Henderson, who was a famous resident of Chesterfield, known for throwing elaborate parties topped off with booze and naked women popping out of cakes. Upon visiting Chesterfield to attend Jack's parties, Madame would fall in love with the area, and in doing so, she would decide to purchase several acres of land in the town, paid for by her close friend Charles Lamar. In 1931, Madame broke ground to build a party house in the woods that she called her castle. It was a cross between a French chateau and a Roman villa. Madame would never actually live in the castle, but instead she lived in squalor in a room in the Furlong farm just down the road. Many years of partying with beautiful and famous people would pass as the aging designer would suffer hardships after her good friend Charles Lamar stopped sending her money. That would eventually lead to Madame Sherri spending less time on the property partying and more time with the locals. In 1959, the castle was vandalized, so badly in fact that Madame vowed not to return to the property. Finally, in 1962, a fire claimed the remains of Madame Sherri's castle, and Madame would eventually end up living out the rest of her days in a nursing home. One day in 1965, Madame was visited by a local woman by the name of Anne Stokes. Anne asked Madame if she could buy her property. Madame agreed. Later that same week, she passed away. After several years of owning the property, Anne decided that she no longer considered herself to be the sole owner of the property, as the locals would flock to the land to enjoy picnics, hikes, and parties in the woods. People would travel from all over to come see the unusual ruins of this remarkable party house. Later, hiking trails were put in, and the land would then be dedicated officially on October 17, 1998, as the Madame Sherri Forest. That is when the forest decided to take on a life of its own. Local teens and adults would go out to the ruins of the castle to throw parties of their own late at night, and paranormal researchers would come from all around to reminisce the history of the land and to possibly get a glimpse of the late Madame Sherri's ghost. Police say that since there have been so many unusual disturbances, from vandalism to theft, that no one is allowed in the Madame Sherri Forest after dark for their own safety. Hikers claim to hear old-time music along with sounds of people partying in the woods when no one else is around. Strange lights, sounds, and stories over the years would start to bring an air of mystery to the woods of West Chesterfield. Graystar decided that it was time to set the record straight. Has Madame Sherri really returned to reclaim her castle? Or is there another explanation for the phenomena experienced by the townsfolk of West Chesterfield, New Hampshire?
Hello and welcome to Strange Things Are Happening. I'm your host, Jonathan Gray. One day, not too long ago, I was browsing through my Facebook newsfeed and I noticed that my friend posted a really cool picture of some stone stairs standing in the middle of a forest. At that point, I was looking for new places in New Hampshire to visit, so I asked her where they were located. She told me West Chesterfield, New Hampshire. I wanted to learn a little bit more about these unusual stairs, so I googled the location and found that the stairs were located in the Madame Sherri Forest, which was about 100 miles away from the Graystar Paranormal Institute headquarters. I figured it would be an interesting place to visit with my team, but I wanted to know a little bit more first before we made the journey. So I dug a little deeper and found a couple websites that claimed that people were experiencing strange phenomena in the woods at night and during the day. Hikers claimed to hear music in the woods and large groups of people when there was no one else around. So my crew and I made a few phone calls and sent a few emails, and finally we came in contact with a woman by the name of Lynn Borofsky, who agreed to speak with us on camera about the Madame Sherri forest. She ended up being the perfect person to speak with about the forest, since she was a Chesterfield Conservation Commission member and she helped put in the hiking trails with her friends. She also put us in contact with Jane Anderson, whose father used to work on Madame Sherri's car. Jane actually met Madame Sherri when she was just a little girl. So our journey began with a 2-hour drive up north to West Chesterfield, New Hampshire. We finally came across a small town center with a library, the Chesterfield Town Hall, and the Chesterfield Historical Society. That is where we met up with Lynn Borofsky.
First, I'm just going to introduce myself and let you know that I'm Lynn Borofsky, and my interest in Madame Sherri came from the fact that I'm a Chesterfield Conservation Commission member. So I put in the trails, many with my cohorts, in this town. And about 2 years ago, I was approached by the Brattleboro Art Museum about, can you give a talk about Madame Sherri? And I said, sure. And then I realized I only knew the folklore in town about her. I really did not know the whole story. So I came to this building and did all my research between the Chesterfield Historical Society and the Brattleboro Historical Society is probably the most information about Madame Sherri. Where was she born? Where'd she come from? She was born in 1876. She was probably born outside of Paris. Some reports say Nice, outside of Paris.
Lynn mentions that Madame Sherri was born in 1876. However, her gravestone reads 1878. My theory on that is that back in the early 1900s, women would lie about their age to kind of make themselves seem a little younger than they actually were. Especially somebody like Madame Sherri. She was a showgirl, so she kind of wanted to appear a little bit younger. Madame Sherri made her way over to the United States back in the early 1900s. So basically what I think is that she came to America, figured nobody knew who she was, and she figured she could get away with lying about her age by a couple years. Tell everybody she's a couple years younger. You know, she's in a new country, she's in a new place, knew her. That was the type of personality I believe that Madame Sherri had. So I think that Madame Sherri was really born in 1876 and that she lied about her age by a couple of years and told everybody 1878, and that's how it ended up on her gravestone.
And she was Antoinette. You will learn that she has many, many different names. Bramarin, Bramaldi. She changed her name constantly, but she was trained as a seamstress, though, as a little girl, so we do know that she knew how to sew, and that was part of her occupation. We know that she eventually was a dancer. So she's dancing in the Paris dance halls. She meets this handsome, handsome man who introduces himself as Andre Raila. But he has another name, Anthony Marcuzzo. But she meets him, and he could be, at that time, we know later that he was born in 1892. Many of the reports say he was older. He couldn't have been, so he's got to be about 17. He meets this fascinating, not attractive, but fascinating woman. And he's a guy, he likes nice clothes. He likes dancing. He's a great dancer. He likes pretty things. He likes money. He likes drinking. He likes partying. And he woos her by winning some money in Monte Carlo. And they get together. Many stories say they elope, but eventually they come to the United States. They immediately get involved in theater, kind of burlesque, vaudeville, big shows. And Andre must be talented because he gets all these gigs. So they're in New York, and they're primarily doing review shows, and you know, we're in the late 1915, 16s. They're settling in New York. Supposedly they have a beautiful house in New York, and in 1916 17, Andre has an accident. During a snowstorm, he's hit by a car. He becomes a little more limited. He has a cane. We don't know if the cane is because he hurt his leg or because he's going blind. You probably read that he eventually dies of syphilis or from drinking bathtub gin. He eventually does go somewhat blind. So they start designing clothes. They really have a knack for it. And because he can't dance as much and because he is losing his sight, they start a house of couture. And it is at that point that they take on the name of Sherri. And there's this play that came out. There's a kind of offbeat burlesque play called Madame Sherri that we think that they took the name from. They thought it was a cool name. And they become legally Andre and Madame Sherri. So one day, this amazing young man, Charles Lamar, walks into their shop. He is looking for work. He's an unemployed vaudeville actor, and he walks into the shop and asks if he can have a job. And he shows some artwork and things. He's quite an artist, and they really weren't sure how to use him, but they did need the extra help. So they take him in, and he really becomes the brains of the costume designing. He did some pretty amazing things. He invented how to paint clothes so it looks like they were embroidered, and he went on in his career to work for Fox. I mean, he was the costume designer. He made it possible for the Academy Awards to have a costuming design, and he won actually 3 Academy Awards in costume design. So he was really amazing artist. Andre's getting older, acting older. It's 1924. First he goes somewhat insane, so he's away in a sanitarium, and he dies. And his short life is over. So Madame is beside herself, Antoinette. She doesn't, she still has the House of Couture, she still has Charles Lamar. The next few years are the years of travel. She and Charles go all over the world. They go to France, they go to Rome, and that goes on for a while, but I believe then at that point Charles Lamar's career is extending, and he's getting more and more famous. And frankly, I think that she kind of tires of working without Andre. Now she comes to Chesterfield. So why does she come here? Well, although it seems very sleepy right now, Chesterfield and Spofford Lake was quite a hoppin' place in the late 20s. And there was an actor named Jack Henderson who had a beautiful farmhouse down the road. And she came to visit him because he was a party boy. He had this big old white farmhouse. And he had these huge parties, very famous parties. The naked girls out of the cake were talked about, and all the booze was delivered by O'Hara, who's a bootlegger from Brattleboro. And Madame comes to one of his parties and loves it, falls in love with the area. And one day, one of the furlong boys who was working up for Jack Henderson drives Madame down the Gulf Road. And she sees this property and loves it. And very soon she starts buying property. That's always interesting because Charles Lamar owns the property. So Charles is providing her with all her monies. And in fact, the settlement when Andre died, she had about $4,000. Still a lot at that time, but not a lifetime of monies. And she buys up the property and then gets this fabulous idea. I'm going to build a party house. I'm going to build a beautiful place. I'm going to build a clubhouse. And then it's going to have side houses, and it's going to have other places to go. And she starts constructing what is known as the castle now. 1931, construction starts. So she never lives there, though. She lives across the street in the Furlong farm, and she lives kind of in squalor. They talk about she's in a couple of rooms, it's not heated, she's got trunks of stuff. This book came from one of the trunks. It's filled with her life in the past. And I think soon she becomes kind of delusional. She's got this money, she's got this great idea, and she's got the rich history. She was the movie star, she was the star, she was the dancer. And she's building this big castle. And she has tons of friends, and they come and have parties, and the parties were wild parties. They talked about that there was one of the trees were tapped for beer and all this, and the house inside, the polar bear rug, the cobra throne that she did sit on and entertained. She bought that car, that beautiful Packard, the touring car, her pride and joy, drove it up to the house. She never drove that car. She always had particularly gay, gorgeous drivers. There were several people in town who said, "Oh, my son's, drove that car when he was 17 years old," and it was always filled with pretty women and her party people.
I'm Jane Anderson. I was born here in Chesterfield and lived here all my life. I've been the Chesterfield librarian for 40 years. But when I was young, I lived down on Twinbrook Road, which is right near here. And my connection with Madame Sherri was that my father, Frank Dean, worked for Paul Welcome, and Paul Welcome was one who watched out for Madame Sherri in her older years. And he sent my dad over when she needed repair work on her car, a 1927 Packard. He went over to check out her car, and then he met Madame Sherri, who was a very little old lady, and he used to take my brother and I, and sometimes my mother would all go over with him to work on the car. He had to get a whole new set of tools. He was a mechanic, but because the car was brought over from England, he didn't have the right tools because everything was metric. So he ended up buying a whole new set of tools just so he could work on her car, which of course later was fine for him anyway because more and more metric came in. Anyway, I was probably 8 or 9, 10 in that area. It was in the late 1950s. And we used to go over and we were interested in her little house that she lived in, and it was just a shed and sort of a little tumble-down house. But while we were there, she asked if we would like to see her castle. So she took us, walked up the hill from Gulf Road, where she was, up to where now is just ruins. But at that time, it was quite impressive stonework. I have a couple pictures. I just thought maybe, first off, this was what the house looked like when I was young. It was all there. The cottage, the wooden part was just a cottage, but all around it was this beautiful stonework, and that's what she was so proud of. And the stairway that went up to the top didn't really go anywhere, except it was impressive. And then the stonework went all the way around the house, and there were trees growing up out of it. And just, you could tell at one time that it was very nice. The kitchen was all down underneath, and again, that was all stonework. So that's how it was when we used to see it. She used to enjoy taking people up, so sometimes when we had guests, we'd all go over there, and she would come out and take us up the hill. The car itself was pretty impressive too. At that point, I guess I wasn't so interested in the car, except that when my dad would fix it up and get it running, we'd take it for a spin. And she always wanted to go over to Brattleboro, so she'd sit in the front with my dad and chat away with him and ignore us in the back seat. There were 2 little jumper seats where my brother and I sat, and then my mother or anyone else that was with us would be on the back seat. And we'd go over the river and through Brattleboro to one gas station where she wanted to buy her cigarettes, and they were the only place she'd buy her cigarettes. And my dad, who never smoked in his life, would be the one who would have to go in and buy the cigarettes, which didn't please him too much. But anyway, there was a beautiful stonework that she created a pond that she called her moat. And so the pathway now over the bridge, which I'm sure you've seen, the stonework all around it, and kind of a pond. And one of our people here in Chesterfield, who has now passed away, did the sketching. Very nice job, Elma Van Warmer, and she's gone now. I think that's all right there. So that's kind of what I remember of her, just being a little old lady. And I didn't know anything about her past, and didn't know anything about that for a long time.
How did she act? Do you know, was she eccentric? Was she
She was quite eccentric. She wore like layers of clothing, and whether it was summer or winter, she was always kind of wrapped up in many layers of clothes. And for my brother and I, she was just a little old lady.
So she was in her later years when your dad started working for her.
Right, yeah. It was like the late 50s, early 1960s, before she got so that she had to be taken to a nursing home, and soon after that passed away. I've heard the rumor, but I think others will speak to that. It was in the care of a person here in town, and one day he just decided it was time to get rid of it. Dug a hole in his field, and according to his son, dug a big hole in the field and buried it.
Remember, she's European. She has that great fur coat. Everyone loves to say that she wore it naked. She was a theater girl. She was always on show. She was European. She kept her money down her shirt. She kept up her thigh. She always was on stage. I think that she gave the illusion of, being many things. Yet she loved the fun. She loved the party. She loved the fun. Charles Lamar's paying for it all. Fill the house up with booze, have big parties. But she lived over across the street. So she is aging, and those parties only last for a few years, and nothing was ever built but the one castle. It was never intended to be year-round. It had some running water from the back. It was wired for electricity, but she never had the electricity in the house. And she starts fading. But before she faded, boy, she drove around this town and created sensation. There are many people who think that she was running a brothel. Her name is Madame. I hardly believe that's true. She ran some nice parties, not a brothel. She was known for just kind of being uncouth. I think she enjoyed that. I also think that she was starting to get a little delusional. So lots of things would happen, but one of the things that started to happen is Charles Lamar stopped sending her money. And she had less and less, there were less parties. She became more closer to the local people to see what they could do for her. And as we got into the late 30s and 40s, she's running out of money, and she doesn't really know what to do. And in 1959, the house was vandalized badly. The paintings that inside of the house had gold jars of, and there was porcelain, and there was the polar bear rug, the famous polar bear rug. Well, I met a wonderful woman in town who used to play with it when she was a little girl, so the polar bear rug existed. The curtains were slashed. Most things were taken. It was destroyed. Rumor has it the Cobra throne went to the Brattleboro High School for their senior prom. So it was destroyed. And she saw the house, and it broke her heart, and she was just screaming in French and wailing. And she said she would never come back to this spot again. So all of the finery, the red velvet curtains, the bistro tables, everything was destroyed. Everything was destroyed. There are probably attics and barns all over this area that have pieces of her things in it. We hope that they come back someday.
The first time her castle was vandalized, she was there, and she was at the foot of the hill, I guess. But anyway, she went and showed us. She showed us how things had been smashed up, and it was pretty sad, and she was pretty upset about that.
The house is destroyed. She goes and she is taken in by the kindness of, listen to this, the O'Hara family. Left the bootlegging business, and now they're in the nursing home business, and so they take her in. And she's out of money. She is, I mean, the pictures, you know, she's just the old lady with the layers of house coats and her cane and chain smoking, but she still has attractive young men with her. So she still has a thing with all the young men. I don't know who this gentleman is. People became interested in her, and now some of the stories are written and some of the history is looking. Somebody once wrote to Charles Lamar and said, what can you tell me about her? And he just basically said that there must be more interesting people to study, because she just was suffering from delusions of grandeur. And hopefully you can find out some information. And a lot of the articles and things that are written are kind of based on some of the false stories that we talked about, that, you know, they weren't married in 1911, and she was not a hooker, you know, she didn't run a brothel, but she ran a party house, and she had great parties. So eventually she holds on to that car, as you know from Jane, you know, but everything else she loses, and eventually the house, the property goes up for sale. And then the house burns in 62. So in 1962, a fire set, no one knows how. I've met a couple of the young guys who were firemen at the time. It burns to the ground, totally burns to the ground. All the wood is gone. So what's left is just the big fireplace from the fire, and the walls and the stone arches. And the stone arches had flower boxes, wooden flower boxes on them. That's all gone. It was all gone. And very quickly, 65 comes upon us. The property's for sale. She's in a nursing home. She's ill. And Ann Stokes enters the picture. And Ann had moved to town in 59. Lovely woman, a Quaker, and has set up an artist colony up on the Welcome Hill. And one day in 65, a friend of hers who's a realtor said, you got to look at this land. This land's for sale. Takes Ann to the land, shows her the Indian pond, and she buys it. She buys it. She thinks it's cool. She buys a party house. I mean, the guts of a party house. She goes to Madame Sherri, this is amazing, who's still alive, that week, and introduces herself and says, you know, I'm Ann Stokes and I'm looking at your land, or I'm thinking of buying your land, or I'm buying your land. And Madame Sherri just says, you know, just take care of it, take care of it, you know, just take care of me. And Ann just holds her hand and agrees. And Madame Sherri dies that week, and Ann buys the land that week. So Ann has the land. What does Ann do? Ann has parties. And Ann had several parties there. But soon she realized that she didn't really own the land, because she was sharing it with not only all the wildlife, but all the people who came to the area. So eventually one day she is in Concord, New Hampshire, and walks by the site of protection of forest and offers it to them. And that's how it comes into public lands. And eventually the commission gets involved, and we put in trails. Continue to have it be open to the public and enjoy, but it is in great ruin, and every year we see less and less and less of the castle. She is buried in a cemetery in Brattleboro. You can go and see and I do have a copy of her death certificate, which claimed her occupation was housewife, which is very funny. Nothing she ever really did.
My name is Jonathan Gray. I'm the founder of Greystar Paranormal Institute, and I've been a paranormal investigator for 19 years. After interviewing Lynn and Jane about the history of the Madame Sherri property, I wanted to conduct a paranormal investigation in order to find out if we could back up the claims being made by hikers. So I called upon my friends from the Keene Paranormal Research Society, and they agreed to come out. Considering that they've been there several times before, I figured they'd be the perfect people to show me around. Before we started our investigation, I interviewed each member of the Keene Paranormal Research Society in order to find out any information that they might have.
After so many times of being here and nothing, absolutely nothing, happened, we were all downstairs and there was a bunch of us. I got really sick and I got a really strange headache. So I had to come up. And because it just felt different, so I came up. And you could just feel the difference in the air. Later on, we went and reviewed the footage and everything. And we got to the digital recordings. And after I sit down, I'm all alone up there. And I'm sitting there and you can actually hear something walking up towards the recorder and something tapped it.
Shay had mentioned upon reviewing the data collected by her EVP recorder that there were footsteps, or what sounded like footsteps, approaching the recorder, and it sounded like somebody had tapped her recorder. While we were there conducting our investigation together, we had a similar experience.
Madame Sherri, is that you throwing parties still when people walk through the forest and hear music at night? Madame Sherri, is that Madame Sherri? Madame Sherri. Madame Sherri, is that you throwing parties still when people walk through the forest and hear music at night?
After I was finished asking Madame Sherri if she was still throwing parties in the woods, there was an anomalous sound inside the right microphone on our EVP recorder. I ran an analysis on the audio that we captured that evening. The results were interesting. The anomaly was consistent with that of an electrical disturbance. However, no electrical devices were present that would disturb our audio recording devices. Not to mention we were right in the middle of the woods. Was Madame Sherri trying to communicate? Take a listen again and decide for yourself.
Madame Sherri, is that Madame Sherri? Madame Sherri. Madame Sherri, is that you throwing parties still when people walk through the forest and hear music at night?
Well, for me, when I was here quite a few years ago, actually, over the top of by the fireplace, I was standing like 7 feet from the fireplace, and I was asking, for some sort of sign that maybe Madame Sherri was here, or whoever was here could be here. So I was asking the question, are you here? If you're here, give me a sign, And so all of a sudden I hear this clank. So I look down and I see this bottle cap on the ground, and it flew at least 7 feet from where I was standing. And for the life of me, I could not debunk it. I couldn't make it go the same exact direction as it went. I tried to do this, try to make it go the same way, and it would not go the same direction it went in.
Me and Sherri went into the woods. She was showing me people call it the giving tree, and people sometimes put things in it, and supposedly Madame Sherri's spirit takes it and does whatever she does with it. I'm not sure. We've also had a lot of shadow play and movements. It's hard when you're in the woods, though. Sherri saw green lights one time we were here, probably about 2 or 3 times. A lot of things we were able to debunk. We heard like what we thought was a baby cry, and it was a Fisher cat. The K2 hit, some of them we debunked as our phones, but other than that, I don't know why there would be K2 out here. I heard what sounded like kid noises, like kids screeching, but there are houses around.
We're here at the Madame Sherri Forest, and behind me is the ruins of Madame Sherri's home, which was burnt down several years ago. And tonight we're going to conduct an EVP session to see if we can communicate with Madame Sherri. Graystar came to the Madame Sherri Forest in order to investigate the claims being made by hikers. Legend says that if you touch the Madame Sherri stairs, you'll hear music from the past and people partying. While we didn't experience that for ourselves, we did, however, capture some very interesting phenomena.
Madame Sherri, in front of this fireplace, is this where you kept your polar bear rug?
Right after I ask my question, you not only hear the audio anomaly on the digital recorder, but you also hear an electronic chirp in the background at the same time the audio anomaly takes place. The reason for this is that whenever I go on an investigation, I carry a mini EMF RF meter that I wear around my neck at all times.
Madame Sherri, in front of this fireplace, is this where you kept your polar bear rug?
The chirping sound came from the meter and corresponded perfectly with the audio anomaly. This is what is called multiple source verification. Most data collected with multiple source verification is almost always presented as evidence ready for peer review. In this particular scenario, we caught an audio anomaly on the digital recorder, and then it was backed up by the EMF meter, alerting us to the unseen activity taking place.
Madame Sherri, in front of this fireplace, is this where you kept your polar bear rug?
During our investigation, I asked about Madame Sherri's polar bear rug. While reviewing the audio data, I noticed an anomaly directly after I asked my question. Upon analyzing the audio and enhancing the anomaly, I was surprised to hear what sounded like a direct response to my question. I asked, Madame Sherri, in front of this fireplace, is this where you kept your polar bear rug? Right after my question, you can hear what sounds like a female voice saying, I did. The following video is going to show you a few minor adjustments that we made to the audio in order to enhance the anomaly we found. Stay alert and listen carefully so that you can get the full effect of what is actually taking place during the audio enhancement process.
In front of this fireplace, is this where you kept your polar bear rug? Madame Sherri, in front of this fireplace. Madame Sherri, in front of this fireplace, is this where you kept your polar bear rug?
You don't realize how much is actually going on around you when you're on a paranormal investigation, especially one outdoors. Having the right tools and the right people can mean the difference between an amazing discovery or a total waste of time. In the Madame Sherri Forest, we had a lot going on around us. Some things we noticed, and other things we did not.
It's a lot out.
There's your train.
Yeah. We got a train response.
So do I think the Madame Sherri Forest is haunted? When it comes down to the facts, our equipment caught some really interesting phenomena that we couldn't observe with our own senses. I also think the data we collected that evening told an interesting story, and it certainly lent some credence to the stories told by hikers. When we asked Lynn Borofsky for her thoughts on the matter, she told us this.
I think that you have a spot that was known for partying and still continues, because every senior prom that happens in this area, you know they sneak in there. I think that it's based on hearing what you want to hear. And knowing that, you know, when you walk into the woods, when you walk into any woods, sometimes you hear the bears that you think are there, sometimes you hear birds that are there, sometimes you picture the wildlife, sometimes you picture the stories. And I think because she was such a draw to this town, I mean, this is a farm community. I mean, we had the Spofford Lake thing going, but she was such a draw and she was such life, and it was so that I think that a lot of people just think that that spirit lives on because you want to hear that, or, you know, it exists. Is there any energy that stays when something happens? People hear stories, they hear what they want to hear, you know, but you can only, you're in the woods and you go, wow, I can't imagine 100 people here partying, what that sounds like. And wait, maybe I hear something on the stairs. Maybe I hear some French being called.
Whenever you go on any paranormal investigation, remember, be honest, be respectful, be open-minded, and be safe. This has been Jonathan Gray, and remember, no matter how normal and boring your day has been, somewhere out there, strange things are happening.